the Baker James Carlton Professor of World Missions there at Gateway Seminary. You're a native of Mississippi, and you've worked among Asian megacities for about 30 years with the International Mission Board and another international corporation. It looks like you've got cross-cultural experience with many environments. You've developed communities in urban high-rises, created strategies for new markets, putting leadership to over 100 expatriate teams, developed leaders, directed onboarding processes for new corporate personnel. In other words, you've had your hand in a lot of mission experience.
Yeah, David, and I did study missions, in academia, but really, almost everything I know, I learned from watching my colleagues, and I never lived in a place where I was the best missionary there. So everywhere I was, there was somebody to watch and learn from, and I really feel like I'm so privileged to have had that opportunity. To learn from so many wonderful people.
Well, in the course of all that experience, you took time to do some study, write a dissertation, and then kind of adapt it into a book called The Ongoing Role of Apostles in Missions. And that's what we wanted to talk to you about today, get a little bit of feedback, a little more understanding, introduce that book to some of the people who will be watching. So we really appreciate you joining us here at Synergy today.
Great to be here.
So we'll just jump in. You wrote as your main argument, apostles, now commonly called missionaries, are God's ongoing gift for the initial planting phase of the church among every people to the end of the age. They are called, sent, and empowered by God for the specific task of spreading the gospel and planting multiple reproducing churches where he is not known. Missionaries should, therefore, intentionally model their character and ministry after the example of Paul and the apostles found in the New Testament. What was it that really prompted your research and writing that kind of led to that very concise definition?
Actually, that's probably at least a 20-year journey for me.
It sounds like it.
From beginning reading something like Roland Allen's Missionary Method, St. Paul's of Ours, which sort of introduced the whole idea of Paul, not just influencing us to be interested in mission, but being a model of mission. And that was a new idea for me. I don't think I'd ever heard that, growing up in church or whatever. But a missionary mentor, the first missionary mentor I had overseas, handed me that book one day, say, you got to start here. And it blew my mind. And so for the next 10 or 12 years, we were serving as frontline missionaries. I was always reading Paul and looking for, okay, what's in this that tells me a little bit about how he did his work? And then, I got into positions where I was doing a little bit more training and not just being the frontliner, and started teaching a little bit more as I gained insight, and continued to read. I continued to look for good resources, books about the same idea. And then along the way, I began to just focus a whole lot of attention on every usage of the word apostle, apostolos, in the New Testament. And about that time, David, by this time I was a regional leader with the IMB, and I was coming back to the States a lot. And on several occasions, I was in a meeting where a very well-known, often leading pastor or leader in even SBC life would speak and say something about everybody is a missionary. I think I know where that comes from. I think what they may be saying is that everyone has a part in the Great Commission, which I agree to 100%.
Sure.
Everybody should be involved in the Great Commission. And I think, and I asked a couple of those guys, and what they said was, they witnessed and they talked to people about Jesus. And I said, yeah, because the church has lost the whole concept of every believer being a witness. Find a church where, even half the people share their faith on a regular basis is probably rare. I think it's rare
Right.
where I live.
Sure.
So what they're trying to say is that everybody should be involved in the Great Commission, and they should be sharing their faith. But what I heard was, and how it comes across to a lot of people is, well, there's no difference between the person who gives 20 years of their life to this task vocationally and somebody who gives 2 weeks. And I think even since then, see, that's almost 20 years ago when that happened. Even since then, the move in that direction has gotten more and more that way. Where, you know, I've had churches say, oh, we've decided to not really support long-term people because we're spending so much money going ourselves on 10-day trips. So I'd always sort of been interested in further study. And now I was teaching my team, I was teaching missionary teams, a lot of the concepts that are in the book. But I realized it would be helpful for me to step back into academia after about 20 years and do a little bit more formal study and get challenged by somebody, you know, to really hone what I'm saying and thinking. And that opportunity came up on the field, didn't even have to come back to the States. And so that's where this came from. A lot of what I wanted to originally do, David, was I was trying to talk to people about the wisdom of following a Pauline model of mission. And the reason for that was, as I was actually at one point assessing well over 100 missionary teams, and I could see that those who are really seeing great response were the ones who were sort of emulating the model, either consciously or not. But then when I would mention that to people, especially who are not overseas, they would look at me with the funniest look. And actually several of them said, well, what's the connection? What's the connection between the book of Acts and missions today? And that's when I realized, and I love to ask groups this when sometimes when I speak. I said, tell me, how many of you are really interested in missions? You know, people raise their hand. I said, so I want you to quote for me your favorite Bible verse that has the word mission in it. And they're all sitting there, you know, and it's just sort of quiet, and they look befuddled, and they say, oh, I know, I'll make it easier. Quote for me your very favorite verse of scripture that has the word missionary in it. And there's no answer.
Right. Well, I do something similar. I ask them to raise their hands if they've been on a mission trip. And then I ask them one by one, what did you do on that mission trip?
Okay.
And then, I told them.
And it didn't have anything to do with the Great Commission, right?
Yeah, I told them about the first week at Boyce. I just told them, sit down, you didn't go on a mission trip.
One reason I take students overseas every year is because most of them have never actually been on a mission trip.
Sure. Yeah.
There's no connection between the biblical model of evangelism, discipleship, and church planting and what we call mission. So, you know, this first book we're talking about is really about who's a missionary and what do they do to some extent. I'm actually working on a book this fall that's really about what is mission, because it's just this big muddled mess in the American church about what mission is. You're right, Bruce. People don't seem to have any idea, and there's no connection. So that's why I chose this topic that I had been studying and teaching on for, I don't know, at least a dozen years, to do further study and hone that argument, do deeper New Testament studies and whatsoever, and then to get it out to whoever I could.
Well, it's more exhaustive than anything Alan Hirsch has written.
Actually, I had a couple of New Testament professors say they think it's probably the most intensive study of the word apostle maybe ever done. They've never seen one that covers every single usage of the word and looks and sort of tries to analyze them. So I'm not a scholar or anything. I'm a practitioner, but I was trying to be a practitioner who was informed. And I want the scripture to be the first source of being informed.
Yeah. Well, that's what really, Don, as I read it, I thought was so important about this particular work, is because it is a good, concise, but at the same time exhaustive complete list of every use of the word apostle and pulling it out, it's very hard to find that direct focus of a work like the ongoing role of apostles and missions today is when it comes to that apostolic idea. Bruce, you've got a little phrase that you use that whenever I've heard that other people hear it and then they say it to me, they look at me and like, what does he mean by that? But he has another one where he says, if you want to learn to make disciples, look at Jesus. If you want to learn to plant churches, look at Paul. And everybody always kind of looks. And I think that distinction is very much like what we're wrestling with.
There's
and
a
what we're
third
talking
part.
about.
There's a third one. There's a
Right.
third statement.
Keep going.
And see how messy it gets. Read your epistles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It never goes
Actually,
according to plan.
I hear people, Bruce, I hear people in the established church, who are generations away from coming to Christ out of paganism or whatever, talk about, 1 Corinthians or whatever, like, boy, Paul was really messing it up. And they just look at the mistakes and all the awful things. And I'm just looking at them and said, if you're looking at a first generation church coming out of paganism in a city
Right.
like Corinth, it's amazing they're so together.
It's amazing he only had to have that many issues he was dealing with, right?
Yes, it was messy, but oh my goodness. And one of the great things, Bruce, I think about serving, with people who've not heard and they're coming to faith, is that so many of those exact same issues keep popping up out there among Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, or whatever. And, it's like the biggest issues we face in the American church, you're looking for something in the Bible that relates directly to it. But in those cases, you're like, oh, I know exactly what the passage is exactly about this, That's just for me, just one of those great things about the opportunity to serve in a place like that.
So as you tried to wrestle between this tension that we're talking about, right, generations old Christianity versus first generation Christianity coming out of even a pagan culture that may have no understanding of a biblical worldview or narrative or anything, you ended up landing on the definition or the title that you used in your book, Missionary Apostle, to describe the apostolic role today. Real quick, just define what you mean by missionary apostle and why did you choose that term?
Well, it's sort of funny because both of those terms come from the same concept, and one is based from Latin, missionary, and apostle is from Greek, and they both mean the sent ones. So I'm sort of saying the sent ones when I say missionary apostle. But in English, just to say apostle throws everybody off because they're thinking either, Catholic apostolic succession, or they're thinking of the 12 and the writing of scripture, or they're charismatic and they think that you're trying to claim to be a bishop with direct knowledge straight from God.
Right.
And it's not any of those things. Is someone who is sent by God, now hopefully in partnership with churches and all that, but the calling is from God. The scriptures state that repeatedly. Calling is from God, and they go to accomplish the Great Commission. And that really is, again, what we're just saying, the baseline is that's evangelism. You don't, in the established church, we think making disciples is about teaching children of Christian families or something.
Sure.
But making disciples, when Jesus said make disciples, there weren't any Christian families. He's talking about from lost people. So it's evangelism, and it is discipleship, but Jesus called that teaching them to obey. And then it is church planning. It is congregating them together. That's the core task of the missionary or the apostle, in this sense, the small a apostle. I've got some friends who call them apostolic missionaries, and I call them missionary apostles. It's all the same. It's just the reason I still use apostle at all, though, is because, again, this gap in most people's mind between what's in the Bible and what missionaries are actually trying to do today. And so I use the word missionary to define the apostle so that they know I'm not talking about one of those other kinds.
So when you're defining that and giving us kind of the thesis for the overview of the entire book, you're saying the specific task of spreading the gospel and planting multiple reproducing churches where he is not known. And then you say missionaries, in this case, missionary apostles, should therefore intentionally model their character and ministry after Paul. So you're coming back to and saying that this missionary apostle is something that's set apart from regular disciple making. It's set apart from a Great Commission Christian. This is the specific role of what we see Paul accomplishing in the book of Acts.
Yes, and I mean, there are a lot of other examples in Acts and the epistles, but Paul is
Sure.
the one we know the most about. And
Right.
I think it's more than just a coincidence that, you know, over half the book of Acts starts focusing its attention mostly on Paul and his team. He had a big team. And so we get to follow along with him and see so much. And if you pull together his epistles and the chapters in Acts, then you get this pretty amazing view of what Paul was up to, and you know, how he built a team and how he preached the gospel and how he made disciples. All those kinds of things start coming together if we actually look at all of it together.
So whenever you take this idea of this core apostolic or missionary task, what do you think are some of the implications, maybe your top 3 implications of embracing this ongoing role of apostle for international missions right now?
Okay, for international. And again, you know, David, I have a lot more experience internationally than I do in America. It's a different thing.
Don't worry, I'm going to plug at you about the American context.
Yeah.
That you've
Okay.
lived here
Yeah.
a
And
little bit.
I find this really interesting. I think we, again, in this big mess that we're in about what missions actually is, we need to be reminded that there are some whom God calls specifically to send to the nations to fulfill this role, to go to pioneer places where Christ is not known and to lay the foundation of the church. And, you know, in the IMB, we said, hey, look, we're not there to build the third story.
Right.
We are looking for local leaders to raise up and empower and turn this over to them, and maybe, you know, continue relationship. We Americans have a problem of ending it and just walking away, but continue relationship. So I think, I mean, that little simple thing is so critical. And I think today, where again, everybody's more focused about where, you know, my little trip or whatever. And I believe in using volunteers. I love to have volunteers. I take volunteers, but it's not the same as that person who's investing in language and culture and relationships and is doing this work there long-term. What we see from both research and from my experience and other leaders within the IMB is that the person who's most likely going to make the greatest impact in missions has been there at least 5 or 7 years, is fluent in the language, has deep cultural understanding, spends a lot of time with the local people, a lot of their time with the local people. They're sharing the gospel boldly. They're investing their lives into new believers. And as they see people with potential to become leaders, they really pour into those people. This is the pattern of, you know, missions that goes all the way back to Paul.
Sure.
And it's very clear around the world today, but most people have no idea that any of that's important, I think. So for me, that's the first implication and maybe the most important. So again, the flip side of that is that some are called to this, not everybody. You know, I've had dialogue with pastors a couple of times, you know, maybe 4 or 5 pastors at a time, where I challenge the idea that everybody's a missionary. And I said, well, you know, just like everybody's a pastor. Oh my goodness, boy, you talk about, you know, getting upset. They said, what do you mean everybody's a pastor? I've spent so many years developing expertise and getting an education and developing skills and whatever. I said, yeah, and I know. And what you do is so much more difficult than doing that cross-culturally, right?
Right. Yeah.
But nobody's thinking that through. Nobody, I don't think most of them are thinking it through, what it means when you say, especially when, I believe when Paul says, all are not apostles, are they?
Right.
And that's how he says it. And the intention is, the answer is no. He wasn't talking about the 12, because when Paul uses the word apostle without a specific reference to the 12, like those who were apostles before me, or the more prominent apostles, or something like that, he's actually just talking about people who are on mission, people who are called to this task.
Sure.
If we lose that in mission, and I fear that we could almost lose this core group of long-term people, we're going to suffer for it. We're not going to impact the nations like we could.
Do you think the catalytic church planter was a response to that? I mean, to the idea of, instead of wanting to call it a missionary, just call him a catalytic church planter?
Well, oh yeah, maybe. You mean like back in the old North American, the home mission, back in the old home mission board days, that's what they called them, back in the probably 70s.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think, Bruce, my guess is they kept running into these guys who were really good at initiating, right, and getting it started, and it would drive them and the church crazy if they stayed beyond a year or two.
I understand.
Yeah, I know you do,
right,
because
rightfully should.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, I mean, at times that idea has almost been lost in American church planting.
Well, and
because we're so focused on the pastoral church planter, which there's nothing wrong with that. But if you've got these guys who are good at initiating, the thing is, David, that you can probably find 10 guys who can take a group of 100 and maybe grow them up to 200 for every one guy that you can find who can start with 0 and get to 100. Right. Or 0 and get to 25 or whatever.
Right.
Most guys are not really gifted at this very initial, mostly, probably in most cases, face-to-face sharing the gospel and discipling from scratch people who are coming out of, non-Christian background.
I've seen it happen more times than not, where a guy goes and he's the apostolic guy, a church planter, plants the church, and it takes, you're right, in the U.S., I think 5 to 7 years, probably is a good
maybe, yeah.
But soon after, they hang on being pastor, and the church has taken a whole different, the church doesn't stay the same, and these guys end up having to step out of the role, and
yeah,
they don't know what to do.
Well, you think about the difference between a pastor, a shepherd, sure, and this initiator, apostle type. A pastor, a good pastor, after he's been there 25 years, is still thinking of all the things he wants to teach. Right. And if he makes it to 30 years, that's probably going to be a really, really strong church. Most of the really strong churches I know had one or more pastors who stayed a very long time. Mm-hmm. Right. So for them to hear that a missionary went somewhere and started a church and 18 months later was gone, or like Paul, maybe doing it in 6 weeks, I've actually heard people say, well, that's just irresponsible. And I'm like, okay, it's a different calling. They're laying the foundation. They're not building the whole building. I think I think there are more people who can play the shepherd role because ministry in the church looks that way.
Right. Well, and I think you're scratching, Dawn, on the itch of some of the implications of the U.S. context that I told you I was going to poke at you about a little bit. Okay. I do understand that your expertise and your experience is 30 years, on an international cross-cultural context. But at the same time, when we look at the vast array of diversity in the United States, I'm in a city of about 1.4 million in its metro area. And even in our context, we have right now about 31 people groups that do not speak English and have no church in their language or culture. And they are not going to be able to engage in any type of English speaking church. It's just not going to happen, even though they're living right
it's
in my
hard to
bag
tell the
world.
church is that. Ooh, yeah.
And so, as you're plugging at it just a little bit, I even have listened as the church planting conversation happens, and I've seen a little bit of a transition where you'll hear people talk where we've gone from pastor planter to at least planter pastor, where we've begun to understand that at least the planter part is something that has to be seen first. But that pastor shepherd idea is just so strong in a 500-year Reformation history context.
Yeah, and that's perfectly understandable. Absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah.
So
when I was called to the ministry, and God told me it was something about the gospel, for 5 years, I just assumed that meant being a pastor because that was the only thing I knew.
Well, I was young, so they told me I had to be a youth pastor.
There was a time when, in order to be appointed by the IMB, you had to have 2 years of pastoral experience.
Well, yeah, and Bruce, I don't know if you remember this, but a little bit before that, my first stateside assignment, I was assigned to go meet as many pastors as I could and tell them they should move overseas and do what they do overseas and be a missionary.
Yeah, and a lot of them did.
And a lot of them did, and some of them actually became a planter pastor and stayed in one place for a long time. But a lot of them really struggled because they weren't being asked to pastor a church, and they didn't know what to do because they were probably called and gifted to be a shepherd.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask I'm going to ask a pretty big question that you may not have a complete answer to, but I'd love to hear you just kind of even think out loud. Then again, you may already have kind of gone here, but with this in mind, as such a strong pastor shepherd understanding of the church in the United States, what do you think is the best relationship, maybe expectation or even a model that shepherd teacher style leadership of a local church and an apostolic leadership of a church planting team look like? What does that partnership, and how can we move towards a partnership where those two, we use the term synergy, SENTERGY, right? Because this is the idea, is that your apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic style guys are working directly with shepherd teachers, and they're using one another's gifts to further the kingdoms instead of, coming against. So in your mind, what would a relationship look like? What's a model that might help these two come together and really expand the kingdom to the benefit of each other?
Well, I think most of us know what pastors are. Like I said, they're around. If we're in the church, they're around us all the time. The real challenge is for pastors to start recognizing and really empowering those guys who are more of the apostolic type. What I found overseas, even in established churches overseas, we were members of churches, local churches in places we live. I often found some man in that church who often wasn't a recognized leader. He wasn't, for instance, a deacon or he wasn't thought of one of the key leaders in the church. But when you got to know him and talk to him, he was out in the village all the time looking for lost people to share the gospel with or something like that,
Sure.
And I was just so amazed. I said, the problem is, and actually part of this was the missionaries, I think, failed to pass this on. The missionaries were looking for pastors. And in the early days, I'm thinking of Bruce, the 70s, 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s, they were not looking for apostle types. So whenever they got an apostle type, they turned him into a pastor and made the church and the apostle miserable in most cases.
That's what happened with our own board, the IMB.
Yeah.
There's that switch to not a switch, but there was going towards the NRM position, and the SE position was built upon his principles of apostolic missionary. Oh. And
Yeah. There was a big shift I would say it took about a decade in the 90s for this big shift, both to see that we're not just doing church extension around the world, we're actually doing something that looks more like Paul and all that. So I think, David, going back to your question, sorry, got sidetracked a little bit. If I were a pastor and I wanted to either plant churches in America or even overseas, I'd be praying for God to call out and raise up. Actually, in Matthew 9, where, we said, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out, actually, that word is ekbalo, not apostello. It's the word for casting out a demon. God is the only one that can take people and cast them out of their comfort zone to the nations or to another city or to another people group outside of their normal way of life. That's really what God does, and finding those people and then working with them, supporting them, encouraging them, whatever the church can do. I think that's really critical. And, I'm looking at this from a distance, so I don't know the inner workings of all that. But when I was in seminary, the Home Mission Board was the most cutting edge missiological organization probably in the United States.
Well, my dad worked as a church planner for Home Mission Board in Cincinnati, and he planted churches Pauline style.
Yeah. And there were all these guys who were that type, and they were also appointing people to go chase after specific language groups and people groups.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden in America, other denominations began to realize those Southern Baptists are doing something, because all of a sudden they've got churches meeting in 50, 60, 70 languages, and nobody in the whole country has that. And actually probably beginning by the 70s, at least by the 80s, the convention was maintaining a little bit of growth almost exclusively on those new ethnic churches, not on the old Anglo churches, which many were in decline. And then somewhere along the way, Home Mission Board, Northern Mission Board decided that that wasn't what they wanted to do anymore. And basically they just sort of slowly shut that thing down. It's really, really sort of crazy. And maybe now are starting to rediscover some of it. And now there are other organizations that are stepping in, Global Gates and others, who are doing it, I think, from a more of a apostolic missionary or missionary apostle perspective, and going after people groups and doing what it takes to actually learn that language if they don't already know it, and those kinds of things. That is more of, sort of a missionary approach than the typical pastoral approach.
Well, I think you're definitely right that there is a reawakening, if you will, especially even in the United States context. I think, whenever I try to explain the apostolic role to people, I tend to say, it's just an international missionary, it's just that we do it here.
Right. Because you could say it's just an intercultural missionary.
Right.
Because that is actually what it is.
It's just that now I think maybe we're lagging behind a little bit in understanding the true diversity that is happening in the United States, and just really coming out into cultures that are no longer Christian, and not necessarily being surrounded by the same old people that have the same old conversations, same old worldview as us. It starts to open up our thinking of really how diverse and how far away the foundation of a Judeo-Christian way of life is in the United States, right?
Yeah. I think the person, and I don't know if you guys knew him, but Don Overstreet, who was sort of the church planting guru for Southern California for 30 years, used to say very openly in Southern California, it's great when people come from outside, but what we're really looking for is the average guy who loves Jesus in Southern California. This is his home, and right. We can make him a church planter more easily than we can somebody who doesn't really understand and is not a native to this unique place in Southern California. So he actually talked a lot about the apostles. Right. Very openly in his work. And people realized that he was raising up local guys to go out and plant churches that were actually doing better than some of the, really more high profile groups sent from outside. So that's one of the things, Gateway has campuses in, Rocky Mountain campus in Denver and in Portland and in San Francisco and here in Southern California and Arizona. And we see a lot of attempts where a mega church in the South, especially, probably grown primarily not from evangelism, but by gathering in people moving to the suburbs from smaller places.
Sure.
And man, we need to catch as many of those people as we can. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's their whole approach to ministry. You build a building and you get a decent worship leader and hopefully somebody can preach okay. And you build the whole thing on, look what we've got, come. And that, just really hasn't worked in most of the West. And when it does, man, we praise the Lord. And there are some that have done that. But, in most places, you just really need to go back and start sharing the gospel and discipling those who believe and those kinds of things.
In chapter 5, in particular, after you lay a foundation, by the way, even working up to that, just your overview of, you briefly mentioned it, of the different ways that apostle has been skewed from the biblical picture in the way that it's used in the Catholic model, for instance, or in a very heavy-handed apostolic, strongly charismatic version, where they're still trying to speak scripture. You do a great job, I think, in the book of just saying, here's the ways the word is used that has caused us all the problems that most people avoid it because of those.
Right.
And we move from that, all those foundational pieces to chapter 5, where I think, the whole book is worth its weight in gold. But that 5th chapter where you start just thinking through some of the implications. And one of those was co-vocational. Most, if not, well, I would say a vast majority of the readers, listeners in Centergy, no, not all, are co-vocational leaders. Our entire apostolic team here in Oklahoma City, where I reside, is entirely co-vocational. We have no full-time at all. Everyone is just someone who works a job and does it volunteer. Bruce is working very, very diligently at OBU, and he can speak to this a little bit as well with his degree program that is really focusing on a co-vocational style of training to send those missionaries over. I just think you spoke. And so I'm going to read a quick paragraph. You said, we should be careful of defining missionary apostles in terms of support. Multiple reasons remain for taking tent-making approach to missions today, which I'm using the word co-vocational in lieu of tent-making.
Right. Yeah, I recognize it.
Right. So lack of financial strength of partner churches, highly developed professional skills on the part of the missionary teams, problems with entry and identity in various countries, and natural opportunities to interact with others are just some of the reasons that tent making should continue. But this sentence in particular, mission agencies should seek ways to facilitate and partner with self-supporting missionary apostles, perhaps claim them as their missionaries. Defining legitimate missionaries on the basis of financial support goes against the spirit and the example of Paul. How do you see this co-vocational role kind of emerging and being used in the future? And Bruce, I want you to chime in as well, since this is where you're really focusing a lot of your work at Oklahoma Baptist University.
Bruce, you want to go first?
No.
Okay. I've just basically written a book about Paul's approach, and it's obvious that Paul's primary philosophy was do whatever it takes.
Right.
And secondly, he was working at a time in which culturally paid speakers basically said whatever the sponsor told him to say. Yeah. And they would find people who were great arguers, and they would hire them to go around and present whatever it was the patron wanted said. And people just sort of knew, well, if the guy's paid, he doesn't really believe what he's saying. It might be really good, but he doesn't believe that. And I think those two things, there were no ATMs, there were no international banks.
Sure.
It was a lot more difficult to even think of helping support someone who is working 1,000 miles away or whatever than it is today. Paul, most of his ministry was self-supporting. And yet what happened very, very clearly is that when a church elsewhere, never from the place where he was planting, but when a church he had planted elsewhere said, we value what Paul did for us so much, and we saw how hard he worked, we're going to help support him. He gladly took that money, and it looks like he actually got to spend more time directly on evangelism, discipleship, and church planting. I'm a little bit, David, right now, I have another concern that's I think a modern thing, and that is that mission advocates are telling people to move overseas and get a job and they'll accomplish the Great Commission, but nobody is telling them how hard it is to have 2 full-time jobs.
Sure.
And that disturbs me greatly. I fear that we're going to have a younger generation go overseas as expatriates, where the average expatriate probably works 50 hours a week, and then that sometimes doesn't include travel back and forth to other neighboring countries or whatever. Very few of them, even if they have the gifting, have the time to really invest in so much of the labor of planning a church cross-culturally. But yes, when we find someone who can do this, and hey, where we are, a lot of our graduates and our students in the far west are bivocational.
Sure.
A whole lot of them. And so, man, I honor them and I admire them. I think if anything, the church ought to recognize these people as going the second mile, though there's generally almost an assumption that they're not quite as good because they're not paid full time. But that is not what the New Testament says, and it's not what history says. But like you yourself, I'm sure, are living out. It's quite a challenge. To do both well. I, for the first time, I had the privilege of being a full-time supported church planter overseas. And a couple of years ago, took on my first bivocational church planting project here in California. And I mean, I knew beforehand it was going to be a challenge, and it really was to be as involved with my students as I wanted to be, but then to do this other project.
Yeah, I think this generation is more open to the concept of ministry on a co-vocational level. We've had a lot of kids who, over 30, who've entered into our new degree program. And what we're trying to do is work with them so that there's no line between secular and sacred. That wherever you are, you can plant a church. But what that means is they have to have a new paradigm of church.
Yeah, right.
And
well,
so,
they need a new paradigm of free time.
Yeah, well, that's why I love to work with Dave and Kirk's team in Oklahoma City, because they take our students and they show them both sides of the coin.
Right.
And
that's great.
That's what we need. We need more of that. Because the kids, they don't, I've had some of them tell me, I don't want to go out and have to raise $30,000.
Yeah.
Is there any other way I can do this? And we have to show them that there are different ways to do it.
I don't know, Bruce, where you are, but I have had people give pushback like, why in the world would we go this direction? And I'm like, do you know nothing about Southern Baptist history? Yeah. The vast majority of our churches were started by farmer preachers or whoever they were, blue collar people who got to a place and they couldn't find a church that preached the gospel that made them comfortable. And so they started their own, probably mostly without a lot of training or preparation, just out of necessity. But we've lost that. And, it's one of the unintended consequences of seminary education.
Yeah.
Actually, the president of my school talks about this. He stated it very clearly a number of times, is that the more the higher percentage of people in ministry who have a seminary education, the slower we grow.
Right.
Yeah. That's true.
And we know overseas movements grow on the backs of co-vocational tent making kinds of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. No doubt.
I do enjoy the tension, and I appreciate the tension, Don, and even Bruce carries the tension with him all the time of, even if you do have a co-vocational team, there tends to still need to be someone who, if not multiple people, who are devoting the vast majority of their time towards strategy, leadership, training, those kind of things, to be able to keep up with and pay attention to the needs, the barriers, the necessities, the training, the coaching, all those things that happen. There's so many things, by the way, that I could ask you about this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it lays an incredibly needed foundation, especially in the United States context, once again, about the apostolic role. It just continues to build upon a movement and a momentum that's moving back towards just seeing Paul for who he was as a church planter.
Right.
And I'm definitely looking forward to the book you've got coming that you're working on in the fall. I know I'll probably read it and recommend it based upon this one so far. But I want to honor your time. I thank you so much for the time that you do have. Is there any last thoughts or something that we weren't able to cover that you think, man, this is something that's really important?
Yeah, something that's crossed my mind, because we were just talking about the whole co-vocational thing. The fact is, I did a good bit of research on Paul's vocation, on his trade. And actually the Pharisees weren't paid workers. They were all basically tent makers. But actually, Paul is probably a leather worker. The tent maker is probably not exactly right. I think their better translation is leather worker. That was the one trade where he could walk into a market in any major city with a little pouch of a few, a knife and an awl and a few little things, buy a piece of leather and start making sandals or whatever it is. And as he worked, there were no loud noises. There were no horrible smells. Most trades had something that made it really hard. Paul could preach and teach and disciple all day long while his hands were busy making whatever it is he was doing.
Sure.
So that is really a critical issue. Bruce talked about, not dividing out the secular and the spiritual, but the fact is, so many jobs, there are not that many opportunities during that 8 hours a day to be sharing your faith or discipling somebody or whatever. But Paul was in the spot, right in the middle of the market, doing the one thing where his hands were really busy, but his mouth and ears were wide open, and he could do both at the same time. And that's really a critical consideration for people who are going to try to do this.
Bruce, any last thoughts or questions from you, brother?
No, I think it was you, David, that said it, that we intentionally want to blur the lines between the sacred and secular. And this is a secular job, and then you have your ministry on the side. We want to blur those lines.
My dad was a very committed layman businessman. He had over 1,000 employees, and he shared his testimony with every single one of them. He prayed for them. He asked them, could he share more of the gospel with them?
Praise the Lord. Yeah.
That's sort of rare in America now today. And actually, when my brothers and I all left home, he and my mom went out and basically became the key people to start a new church, just because there needed to be one. So I actually saw that, growing up from my parents who were so committed to the task.
Well, Don, I appreciate the time with us today. I was going to show everybody, this is the book, The Ongoing Role of Apostles in Missions, The Forgotten Foundation. It's by Dr. Don Dent. You can go and check it out. I grabbed mine off of Amazon on my Kindle so I could read it ASAP.
And it's much cheaper.
Yes, it was. I wasn't going to say that, but that's part of my decision.
Oh my, yeah, I would imagine 95% of the books are sold on Kindle.
Well, and I can carry my library much easier on a Kindle than I can on a shelf.
Absolutely.
We thank so much for your time. For those of you people who are Synergy who are going to see this, you guys go grab that book. It's going to be well worth your time to read it. Dr. Dent, get back with your afternoon. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.